Hey there, this video is all about the Canon C80. And before we get into it, huge thank you to B&H Photo who lent me the C80 to test out, review, and make this video for all of you. So if you're looking to pick up some camera gear, go check out B&H. It's where I buy most of my stuff from. There are affiliate links in the description for the C80 and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So again, huge thanks to B&H Photo. Now, I have a lot of experience with Canon cameras. I've pretty much used or owned all of the Canon mirrorless cameras and several of the cinema cameras like the C70, the R5C, the C100, the C200. So I have a lot of thoughts and opinions about the C80, and there is a lot to cover with this camera. So I'll do my best to cover as much as possible in this video. First of all, let's talk about the image quality. I took the camera out to the lake for a couple of quick shots and to try to capture the fall colors, but it was super cold and windy that day and I didn't last very long, but what I got out of the camera was awesome. I was able to take this out and help out some of my friends who were doing an engagement shoot, and luckily the clients were cool enough to let me share the footage with all of you. The footage I'm about to show you was not what was delivered to the client. I was sort of a B cam or second shooter. I just put together this sequence to show you what the camera was capable of. I filmed all of it in 6K RAW. There was no noise reduction added in post. And in terms of lenses, I used the RF 24-70 and a few other lenses that I can't talk about yet, but review coming soon. So hope you enjoy. So I think that the colors looked absolutely amazing out of this camera, and it's pretty much what I expected with a Canon cinema camera. Grading the files was also super easy. Bringing the RAWs into Resolve, you have a good amount of RAW control. And I do want to mention that with the RAW files, the sharpness defaults to 10, so I turned that down to 0 on all of the shots. There is also no ISO control in the RAW controls in Resolve, so you just want to be aware of that. It's not as robust as some of the other RAW codecs with more controls that you get when you're in Resolve. Next, let's talk about dynamic range, and I will compare the C80 with the C70 and the R5C. Now, the first thing I did while I was out shooting is I wanted to try to capture a scene that had a lot of dynamic range even before I got to do my technical testing. So taking a look at this shot here, this was shot in the library of the couple, and I exposed for the windows, and you can see right off the bat here all the noise in the couch on the bottom left and in the guy's jacket. This is right out of camera without any grading. And here it is after I graded it. There's no noise reduction added here, and you can definitely see, I'm holding on to the information, the highlights, but there is quite a bit of noise in the shadows, so we will take a look at this with our nerdy testing. Now, whenever I test dynamic range, I do it in a couple different ways. I like to look at a high dynamic range scene like that library shot. And I do this at my house where I stand in a dark room next to a bright window, and it's a little bit more controlled and I can compare cameras. And then I also look at the latitude or push-pull test. I will compare the dynamic range of the C80 with the C70 and also the R5C, because I think those are the cameras most people are going to be interested in seeing how the C80 stacks up against that. So taking a look first here, this is the C80 versus the C70. And what I do, like I said, is I expose for the highlights, and then we'll take a look at the shadows. So this is already graded, but this is the 6K RAW on the left out of the C80, and on the right we have the Canon C70 in the 4K RAW. Now both of these are interpreted as C-Log2 when you are in Resolve. And taking a look here first at the highlights, when you look out through the window, I think they look pretty similar. I don't see a big difference between the two in terms of their highlight performance. But looking at the noise, looking at my shirt in particular, the C70 is a lot cleaner. Now, it does look like I missed focus just slightly on the C70, unfortunately, but zooming in here, ignore the autofocus, but look at the shadows specifically. Like, look at my shirt. You can see that the C70 is way cleaner. There is way less noise going on in there, and that's because it has that dual gain output or DGO sensor where it records the highlights and the shadows at the same time. It combines them into that image, and you get really, really clean shadows. It's a really strong point of the C70. So I would definitely say that, you know, the highlights were looking pretty similar. We're looking out through the window, but there's definitely a difference in the shadows here, and we'll definitely have to take a look at the latitude test to see the differences in the shadows. Next, we'll take a look at the C80 on the left in the 6K RAW ST and the R5C in the 8K RAW ST on the right. Now, this was interpreted as C-Log2. Now, the R5C does not shoot C-Log2 in its compressed codecs, but when you do shoot RAW, you can interpret the footage as C-Log2 or C-Log3. Here it is interpreted as C-Log2, so it's more comparable. Taking a look at these two images, I don't see a huge difference in the highlights again, and probably because we're using C-Log2 on both cameras. And in terms of the shadows, there are definitely some difference in colors, but in terms of the overall noise, they're looking a lot more similar than the C80 against the C70. So zooming in here to take a closer look at the noise, you can see there's a little bit of difference in the colors. It looks like the chroma noise is pushing a little bit more green on the C80 and maybe a little bit more neutral, maybe a slight magenta shift on the R5C in the shadows. But from this first test here, I'm thinking they look very, very similar. We'll have to take a look and see with the latitude test to see what the differences are between the two in the shadows. Next, we'll take a look at the latitude test here. This is the C80 on the left and the C70 on the right. And what I do here is I over or underexpose the image in camera and then use the raw controls to bring it back in post. This is not to see how well you can over or underexpose the image, but how the camera actually performs in its extreme dynamic range. Here they are, 4 stops over, both looking pretty good. At 5 stops, they just both slightly start to break, but look really similar. Now on to the underexposure test, and this is where we'll probably see a big difference in terms of the dynamic range. At 1 stop under, they're looking pretty similar. Once you hit 2 stops, you start to see the noise getting very different on the C80. The C70 is definitely showing its strength here with that DGO sensor. I would definitely say there's a significant advantage here for the C70 in its dynamic range in the shadows. Next, we'll take a look at the C80 against the R5C, and remember from the window test, these were looking pretty similar, so I'll be curious how they do in the shadows. But first of all, we're looking at the overexposure test here. Most cameras are good through 4 stops, and these are no different. So 3 stops over, 4 stops over, looking very similar without much of a change. When you hit 5 stops, pretty similar, like we saw with the window test, both interpreted as C-Log2. Now for the underexposure test, this is where it's interesting. 1 stop under, thinking they look pretty similar here. Once you hit 2 stops, they're starting to get a little bit noisier, and I think the C80 definitely does a little bit better in the shadows here than the R5C. Not a huge advantage like C80 versus C70, but I have to give a small advantage to the C80 over the R5C in terms of the shadow performance. So overall, C70 definitely has more dynamic range than the C80, and the C80 has a little bit more dynamic range than the R5C. Next, let's talk about the low light or high ISO performance of the C80. And one thing that's really unique about this camera is that it has a triple base ISO. I think a lot of us are starting to get more familiar with dual base ISOs, but we have triple base ISO in this camera. Now, depending on which profile you're shooting in, but if you're shooting in RAW or the compressed codecs in C-Log2 and C-Log3, it has a triple base ISO of 800, 3200, and 12,800. If you're shooting some of the other profiles, there are different bases, but you can definitely take a look at this chart and see what they are. Now, with this triple base ISO system, there's a few different ways to operate that, and I want to show you some of those, and we'll test that out, and then we'll look at the low light performance and compare it with the other cameras. So in the menu here, you can see that there is a base ISO selection. You can do auto selection, or you can choose the different bases. So if you choose auto selection, when you go up and increase the ISO, it will actually change the base for you automatically. So let's take a look first and see if it's on auto ISO selection where the bases will switch. All right, so to do this, I just did a very simple test. I've recorded the camera with the body cap on to check out the noise performance. As we creep up through the ISO range, we'll see here that at 2500, it will clean up at 3200. Now this is just measuring the noise. So you can see as you increase the ISO, the noise obviously increases. And we'll see here if it actually switches over at 12,000. So here's 10,000 and at 12,800, it cleans up. So when you leave the auto base selection turned on, it will switch off as you expect at 800, 3200, and 12,800. Now take a look at the three bases compared against each other. They have similar amounts of noise, but like you would expect when you get to 3200 and 12,800, you definitely get a little bit more noise. They're not exactly the same. So of course, if you are up at 3200 or 12,800, you can expect to get some more noise. Now I do want to talk for a moment about if you're manually selecting the bases and what you can expect and why you might want to do this. Well, first of all, if you're looking at this chart here, if you're looking at the low base, you can shoot between ISO 100 and 12,800, the middle base between 400 and 51,200, and the high base from 1,600 to 102,400. Now, those ranges that I just showed you are based on the fact if you have the extended range turned on. If you have the extended range turned off, you will get a different range for each of those base ISOs. But we'll leave this on for now. Now, if you come into the base ISO, and let's select base ISO 800, that's the low base. Now, when you leave here and you come and you change the ISO, like I said, you can go from 100 only up to 12,800. And if you come in here and change it to 3,200 for the middle base, for example, and you come back in the ISO here, you can see you can go from 400 up to 51,200. So those are the ranges that you saw on that graph. So why would you want to use the manual base selection? Well, you may want to be shooting at the second base ISO, for example, but you want to shoot below the second base, like at 1,600 or 2,000, to try to increase the amount of information in the shadows or shift the dynamic range towards the shadows. Now, this is a much more advanced technique, and for most people, I really recommend that you just leave it on auto selection. But if you're curious, I did make a video a while ago about shooting off base ISO, so I'll leave that video linked down below. Now let's get on to the actual low light testing of the C80. So here's a quick test that I shot out at night to give you an idea of some images shot with higher ISOs. I think this might have been a little bit underexposed, but you can definitely see the noise going on here. And this is raw without any noise reduction added in post. So as you're increasing the ISO, of course, you're increasing the noise. The big thing here is going to see what happens at 12,800 right here. It definitely cleans up and you get a much cleaner image. I would say the camera does pretty well in the sort of middle and high ISO range. I don't think it's a low light specialist or anything like that. I would probably assume that the Sony cameras do better than the Canon C80, but I don't have a FX3 or an A7S3 or an FX6 to compare against the C80 at the moment, but I think it does pretty well. And the fact that you do have the ability to go up to those different bases and then you can manually change which base you're in and sort of shift the dynamic range around and stuff is pretty cool. All right, now we'll take a look at the C80 on the left and the C70 on the right. Remember, the C70 does not have a dual or triple base ISO. So here we are at 2,500 going to 3,200. You see that the C80 cleans up. In the middle ISO range, I think that the C80 is a little bit cleaner here, but not a huge difference. As we get higher at 5,000 and 6,400, they're starting to look a little bit more similar. And of course, once we're creeping up to that 12,800, we'll probably see an advantage for the C80. Here are at 10,000. You can see the noise is getting a lot worse on both cameras. Now at 12,800, the C80 cleans up and gets ahead here. Now, I think the C70 has a bad rap for low light performance, but in my own use, I think it does pretty well in that middle ISO range and is a lot cleaner than people give it credit for, but I have to give an advantage here for the C80 over the C70. Now we'll compare the C80 with the R5C. Remember, the R5C also has a dual base at 3,200, so both of them will clean up at 3,200. Now, after 3,200, I think that the results are pretty interesting here. I think that the luminoise looks fairly similar between the two cameras, but it looks like the chromanoise is actually worse on the C80, which is pretty interesting. Now, of course, the C80 has that 12,800 coming up, but the R5C is just going to get progressively worse in the higher ISO range. But you can see at 8,000, 10,000, the R5C is better. Now, once you hit 12,800, I'd say the luminoise looks pretty similar at that point, but I think the chromanoise is slightly even worse on the C80. So kind of unexpected results here with the R5C definitely hanging in there against the C80 and maybe just slightly better in a lot of those ISOs. Next, let's talk about frame rates, codecs, and resolutions. So if you're shooting full frame on the C80, you have a bunch of options. You can shoot raw LT, but you can also shoot XFABC, XFHEBCS, and XFABCS. And when you're shooting raw LT, you can shoot in basically the full size of the sensor, 6,000 by 3164, and you can shoot up to 30 frames per second. When you are shooting in any of the compressed modes here, you can shoot in either DCI or UHD, and that's going to be oversampled from 6K, and you can shoot that up to 60 frames per second, or you can shoot up to 120 frames per second in SNF mode. Now, if you come over and you select Super 35, which crops in on the sensor, you have a lot of similar modes. You have RAW ST, which you can shoot up to 30 frames per second. You have RAW LT, which you can shoot up to 60 frames per second. And then you also have the compressed codecs here, which will shoot up to 120 frames per second or 180 frames per second in the long up. So there are plenty of recording options in terms of resolutions, frame rates, and codecs. Next, let's talk about the sensor readout speed, or the rolling shutter performance. When I tested this out, I got some awesome results. So the 6K RAW in 24 frames per second, I got 9.5 milliseconds, which is great. The 4K XF AVC, which is oversampled from the 6K resolution in 24 frames per second, I also got 9.5 milliseconds, which makes sense. The 4K 120, which was in SNF mode and a compressed codec, I got 7.4 milliseconds, so it's probably throwing away some pixels there in some sort of line skipping or pixel bin mode. And the 4.3K Super 35 RAW mode, I got an even faster readout at 6.9 milliseconds. So overall, the sensor readout speed is awesome on this camera. It's great to see, you know, a camera with sub 10 milliseconds. This camera does not have a global shutter, but for a rolling shutter sensor, I think it does perform really well. One great addition to the C80 was the inclusion of an SDI port. Now this camera has two video outs. It has an HDMI and a 12G SDI, and they can both put out a 4K signal. But what's really neat is that you have separate controls for each in terms of the resolution output, the view assist, clean feed or not, etc. Let me show you. So here are some of the settings. You can turn the SDI output on or off here if you just want to use HDMI. You also have separate controls for the resolution for SDI and for HDMI, which is really cool. You can change those right here. The customization of HDMI and SDI continue, where you can toggle view assist on or off. So for example, if you want it on for HDMI but off for SDI, you can do that. And then the on-screen displays, you can change that too. So let's say you want to have no menus on the SDI output, you want a clean feed, and then maybe you want the on-screen display for the HDMI. I could see this being really handy if you are, for example, sending an SDI signal out for a broadcast or a live stream or somewhere else that you don't want to see all the information on there, you just want to see the image. But then you can also plug in an HDMI monitor into the camera for the operator to be able to see all the on-screen information, which is just really handy to have the ability to switch those. I could even see this being useful for myself in my studio here for live streaming, or I want to send a live feed out to my computer for live streaming, but still have a confidence monitor with all the settings. So really cool to have both and to be able to customize them so well. In terms of battery life, Canon says you should get about 3 hours with the included BPA30N, which is fantastic. And I know from experience that the C70 also has amazing battery life. Now, Canon's pretty accurate with their run times, and it will decrease with using compressed codecs and higher frame rates. You can also use the BPA30 batteries, the older ones, but the new BPA30N allows the use of some extra features like some hot shoe accessories. Next, we'll talk about the build quality, the ergonomics, and the I/O and all that kind of stuff. Now, very, very similar to the C70. There are a few differences. I think most of you are watching this are probably pretty familiar with the C70, so I will use that as a reference here. Looking at the top of the two cameras, the main differences are going to be the fact that you have a dedicated area for the top handle. It does come with a new top handle, and I was using it, and it is pretty decent. It has a different design, and in my opinion, is pretty comfortable. I don't love the material and the way it feels in your hand, but it was pretty good and a little bit better than the old one, what I remember using on the C70. So you have a dedicated place to attach that, and then you have that hot shoe for attaching accessories, whereas the C70, you just have that area to screw in into the cold shoe up here. Other than that, on the top, you can see you have the SDI port, which you don't have on the C70, and the sensor locating hook moved from the left side to the right side, but the right-hand side of the camera is completely the same there. Onto the port side, I don't think anything has changed over here. We still have two XLR inputs that are mini XLRs, and they are phantom powered. We have our HDMI port. We also have our ND filters. Again, same as before, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So basic same experience on the left-hand side other than the SDI port that's up here. Onto the bottom, I think is probably one of the biggest upgrades from the C70. We had this awful situation here where you didn't have two screws to mount a long plate. So there was like putting a base plate on it or other things, whereas the C80 has the same basic one, but they added the quarter 20 up in the front there to allow you to screw into, which is awesome. And then onto the right side of the cameras, they are pretty much the same. We still have SD cards and the whole 2 SD cards in here. And we also have the time code port over here. Now onto the back of the cameras, they're fairly similar, a couple small changes. We have a change in the joystick here, and it is replaced by this guy over here. So the sort of orientation of the buttons and stuff are a little bit different there, but the bottom right's the same. We do have an Ethernet port added here, and again, the new battery, but otherwise fairly similar. They did upgrade the LCD hinge a little bit. There's this or LCD, the way it works, there are these little latches here that click in. But otherwise, I think the screens are pretty similar. So overall, not a huge amount of differences. I think the upgrades to the SDI port and the bottom were probably the 2 biggest ones for me between the 2 models. So if you're unfamiliar about the brightness setting on the Canon cinema cameras, it's actually the luminance setting here. Now the C70, I believe, only goes up to +2. And when I got the camera, I immediately cranked this up all the way to +6. But what I noticed is there's some shooting situations, especially when it's a little bit darker, the screen was too bright and I was missing some exposure and adjustments and stuff like that because it didn't quite look how it looked when I was actually filming. So be careful with the luminance. This is how you adjust the brightness, but I did notice that it pushed up a lot higher in my experience than cameras like the C70 and the R5C. Next, I want to talk about the SD cards, and this is something I really wish Canon had upgraded to CF Express B cards, or at least one CF Express B card. Now, of course, there's going to be this product delineation or cripple hammer, or whatever you want to call it, where if you want a CF Express B, you have to buy the C400. I do think that they tried to save some money without redoing too much of the camera and sort of kept this right side of the camera and then still used SD cards. But at this point in late 2024, CF Express B cards are actually cheaper than V90 SD cards. They're much faster and they're more reliable and they're more robust, and I much prefer to use them not only in the camera but also transferring data from the card to the computer. So I think that was a little bit of a miss in the SD cards. Also, I do believe that's the reason why you cannot record 6K 60 RAW in the C80 versus you can in the C400 because of the write speeds of the SD cards versus the CF Express card write speed in the C400. Next, I want to talk about the sensor that is in the C80. And if you notice right off the bat here that it isn't a normal video sensor that's usually 16:9 or 17:9. This one has a ratio of 3:2 like a photography sensor. So looking at the specs of the C80, it has a 6K full frame back illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. The total pixels are 26.67 with a resolution of 6202 by 4300. It has a pixel width of 6 microns. Now, this seems very similar to a photo hybrid camera that I know and love, and that is the R3. So let's take a look at the specs of the R3 sensor. It is also a full frame back illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. Total megapixels are 26.7, very similar to 26.67. The pixel width is 6 microns. Now, in terms of the sensor readout speeds, when I tested the C80, like I said, I got 9.5 milliseconds for the 6K RAW readout speed, and I haven't tested the R3, but I checked CineD's website and their test for the 6K RAW also got 9.5 milliseconds. So you can probably see what I'm getting at here. Now the R3 does not have a triple base ISO, but none of the Canon's mirrorless cameras have a dual or triple base ISO. They leave that for their cinema cameras. I assume that the C80 sensor is a modified R3 sensor, which is not a bad thing at all. Now, I found the R3 sensor to be amazing with great dynamic range, low rolling shutter, great colors, and great in low light. And I love the R3 and the image that it produces. Now, so 2 things I want to bring up here if my theory is correct. First of all, let's get open gate recording in the C80 and C400 since it has a 3x2 sensor. Now, I don't know if, the top and the bottom of the sensor don't have all the circuitry that the rest of it does. I'm not sure, but it looks to me like it has a 3x2 sensor in there. So we should be able to do open gate recording. But again, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes here and all the tech that's in the camera. I'd love to have open gate recording, not only for reframing and resizing images, but also for anamorphic support, because having a taller sensor allows us to get better images when using anamorphic lenses and their squeeze factors. Also, If this is true, there is no reason why we can't get C-Log 2 in the R3. And I'll just tack in there the R5C as well. But anyways, the R3 should perform, in my opinion, probably very similar to the C80. I would love to test them out against each other, but I don't currently have an R3. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. In terms of autofocus, it is a little bit different than the C70 and R5C. Now we have the ability to change the subject detection from people to animals. So I didn't do a lot of testing on the autofocus. I did use it a little bit. When I did notice when I was out shooting with the RF 24-70, the autofocus worked pretty well. I really didn't really have a lot of complaints on it, but for the kind of stuff that I shoot generally, like the R5C and C70 do pretty well also. I did, of course, have to take it out to do a little bit of testing with the animal autofocus, and I used the C80 here with my RF 100-500. You see this cormorant standing out there pretty far away, and it does a pretty good job at autofocus. Here it is zoomed in at 200%. I don't think it's dead on perfect. I think it's pretty good. The camera was picking up the bird though, and it was showing up. Here's another shot of a cormorant in a different situation here, and zoomed in. You can see the autofocus is kind of going in and out a little bit. So it wasn't perfect. I think I'd have to play around with it more and maybe play with some of the settings. I was using the default settings in there. You know, it was recognizing the bird, and the bird was showing up with a box around it, but as I showed you there, it was kind of, you know, moving a little bit. Also, the water was moving by pretty quickly. I don't know if that has any effect to it, but not the same performance that I'd get in their mirrorless cameras like the R5 II or the R3. Another thing that's cool about the C80 over the older cinema cameras is that C80 has built-in Wi-Fi. So it's not in the C70, the C300 Mark II, the C500 Mark II. It is in the R5C, but this app doesn't work for whatever reason. The cool thing about this is that you can use Canon's Control App, and I haven't used this a ton because this is the first time I've had a camera that can use it. You can add Wi-Fi modules to those other cameras to make it work. I just haven't had the ability to try that out. It seems to work really, really well. You get a live control, a live feed, and you have all sorts of controls in the camera. So this is something I'd definitely like to pursue a little bit more and work with, because one thing I think all these camera companies need to work on are their apps. I love the way, for example, Red's Control app works. I know Sony has one. I haven't really got to play with it yet. So that's really cool that this camera has built-in Wi-Fi and you can use the Canon Control app. So like I said, there is a lot to talk about with the Canon C80. So let me try to wrap things up and talk about the other cameras and those sorts of things. So should you upgrade from the C70? If you own a C70, should you be looking at the C80? The main things you're going to get with buying a C80 are going to be full frame, which is important for some people. You get the newer autofocus system. You get built-in Wi-Fi. You get that triple base ISO, but you give up a little bit of dynamic range and that DGO sensor, which a lot of people have become pretty attached to because of the way the image looks. Now, one thing that people have been critical about the C70 is that it's a little bit soft. And the reason why people say that is it doesn't have a oversampled image from 6K or 8K. It has a native 4K sensor. And I believe that the DGO sensor also adds to some of that softer image, which can be a good or bad thing depending on what you're looking at. So let's take a look at this basic comparison I did outside, and the colors don't match here. I didn't even touch the colors. These are different cameras, but I did use the same lens on both cameras. I used the RF 15-35 at 35 millimeters and f2.8. Now, I don't know if this is going to come through on YouTube, but hopefully you can see if there's any difference in sharpness. I did shoot these in RAW, no noise reduction, sharpness all the way down to 0. And, you know, me looking at it here, the C80 is slightly sharper than the C70. Does this make a difference in the real world or how you're delivering the image? I'm not really sure, but I just wanted to show you that example and show you that there is a little bit of difference there, of course, with the 6K and the 4K. And this is because I was, this timeline that I'm making this video on is in 4K and I'm uploading in 4K. So those are the kind of the differences. I think for some people, just the full frame, maybe the Wi-Fi with that built-in control app and the triple base ISO might be enough to give up a little bit of dynamic range, but that's really up to you. Now, the next question is, should you upgrade from an R5C to a C80? If you want a little bit more dynamic range, C-Log 2, smaller RAW files in full frame, which is really cool, built-in ND filters and XLR inputs, that's maybe the main reasons why you want to go for a C80. But you give up the 8K, the CF Express B cards, and the ability to take stills. Also, there's a huge difference in the form factor. I don't personally love the form factor of the C70 and the C80. It's kind of different and weird, and I think clients don't know if it's like a cinema camera or a photography camera. It's just big and chunky, but I do like how run and gun it is and how compact it is and how everything's built in. You can kind of just walk out of the house with a battery and a lens and a memory card, and it's pretty simple. So overall, what are my thoughts? The C80 is an amazing camera. It does exactly what you'd expect it to do. I don't think there were really too many surprises after testing and reviewing this. This is very powerful, robust, easy to use, all-in-one, run-and-gun camera that you can use for a lot of different things. It is very versatile. You could use this for corporate work, for lots of different client work, commercial work, documentaries, narrative, content creation. This camera can pretty much be used for almost anything, and it has great image quality. So anyways, it was really cool to test out the C80 and share that with all of you. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.